How's it going, everyone? It is 6:05 on Monday evening, and it is time for this week's episode of Riding in Cars with Cards. It is August 19th, 2019, and this is the show where I take snapshots of formats. We're talking about single cards, we're talking about decks, we're talking about archetypes, where the podcast is more general, evergreen, finance, that kind of stuff. This is much, much more specific to, points in time where it was taken from. Either learning lessons from the present as, things are developing in front of us, or learning lessons from the past. And that's what this week's episode is about. So I talk all the time, literally all the time, about my very first competitive standard deck. And what I figured what might help get it out of my system so I can quit referencing it so much, and what might, give us something we can learn from, is if we actually just dissect what that deck was, what it was about, what it did, what was good, what was bad about it, and where it fell in the landscape of its format. So the deck in question was Heartbeat Harvest Combo. It was the very first competitive standard deck I ever built. Now, there were several that I had built before then, but I would not call them particularly competitive. I had like a green-white tokens deck at one point, but it was like way too all-in and not playing nearly enough lands, and I was just trying to be cute. And then I did the same thing not too long afterward when I did it with I tried to build Dimir Mill because, I was really big into mill decks at the time, as the most casual of players tend to be. But ultimately, I got tired of getting my teeth kicked in by my competitive friends down the road. So shortly after watching my first Pro Tour, I started looking at what I could build. And it turned out, between my friends there locally and some deft trading at the LGS, I was able to build one of the top 4 decks from that Pro Tour. The Pro Tour in question being Honolulu 2005, 2006. I want to say 2006. Yeah, it was 2006. Anyway, the deck was piloted by one Maximilian Brocht. And I believe he finished in the top 4. I want to say either top 4 or top 8. I can't remember which. Honestly, I genuinely cannot recall. Probably top 8, now that I think about it. But Brock's deck was this Heartbeat Harvest combo. Now, to paint the picture of where the standard format was, we had a lot of aggressive white and red decks, to the point that we had Boros, we had Zoo, we had Gruul, we had there wasn't a mono red deck because it just wasn't good enough. There weren't enough good creatures. But Zoo was a deck that was playing 10, 12 1-drops, and then 8 to 10 2-drops, and then 4 3-drops, and that was it. They sideboard into Giant Solifuge as an extra 4. Some of them would sideboard into Rumbling Slum as another big 4. But nothing like the kind of Zoo deck, the thing that comes to mind when you talk about Zoo in Modern. It was much, much more aggressive. And the deck that ended up winning the Pro Tour was Gruul Aggro, so I wanted something that seemed to have at least a puncher's chance against that. And then in the next tier of decks, it was all of the various black-white decks, either aggro, mid-range, control, splashing other colors. The vast majority of them were either built around Dark Confidant or Phyrexian Arena, and which one of those two they were built around determined what they, the kind of game plan they had. The more aggressively slanted decks were built around Dark Confidant, while the more long game, pure mid-range, if you will, playing, bigger, more powerful cards was built around Arena. Phyrexian Arena, specifically. Not MTG Arena. That wasn't even a twinkle in anybody's eye at that point. But I digress. What was it that made this deck special? Well, one, the combination of the aggro decks being really, really, really good and the mid-range decks having a lot of disruption really did a number on the control decks of the format. To the point that even though we were playing in a standard format that had Mana Leak and Remand and Rewind, there were no counterspell heavy control decks. The closest we came was the initial, early surge of Ravnica Kamigawa 9th with Mike Flores' Juicy Blue. And that deck played, 10, 11 counterspells, I think, maybe, in the whole 75, and those were just to protect yourself long enough to resolve a Moloku or a Moloku the Clouded Mirror or a Kega the Tidestar and just take over a game from there. You weren't interested in playing a game of Magic that lasted 50 turns. You wanted to play a game of Magic that lasted 10 turns. You were okay with that. Where, everybody else was looking for turn 5. You were okay with stretching it out a little bit, but you weren't anything like, white-blue approach or the white-blue control deck that kind of popped up during the Chain Whirler summer last year. There was no, I'm just going to use my Teferi tucking itself as my win condition and mill you out. None of that was happening. And because of that, that meant that counterspell heavy decks just didn't really exist at the time. You didn't have a deck that was built around that kind of big, dumb, crazy long game where they're going to nickel and dime you. They were more interested in big one-shot powerful effects like Tidings, draw 4 for 5 mana. Kega was just the best creature in Standard at the time. 6 mana, 5/5. When it dies, I'm taking your best thing. And Moloku the Clouded Mirror just, you were going to hit your land drop every turn regardless, and Moloku would turn excess lands into an army of 1/1 flyers to kill your opponent with. So, what was it about the Heartbeat Harvest deck that made it special? Well, it specifically exploited the hole in the format of counterspell control. Because that didn't exist, this deck was allowed to. It was a combo deck that wanted to make somewhere in the vicinity of 25 mana or more on its 4th or 5th turn. With, absolute complete and utter nut draws, you could do it on turn 4. But most of the time, you were going to have to do it on turn 5, and you were going to have to get creative. So, its namesake cards were Heartbeat of Spring and Early Harvest. Heartbeat of Spring says when a land is tapped for mana, add an additional mana of that color to your mana pool. So it essentially doubles your mana, but it adds 1 to all of your mana producing lands. It doesn't double. Adds 1. Well, in multiples, it's obviously great when you're trying to get lots and lots and lots of mana because, you get 2 of them down, your land's tapped for 3 each. That's great. That does exactly what you want it to do. But that doesn't get us to 30 in a reasonable time frame. Well, that's what Early Harvest was for. Notable, this was the biggest reason I got this deck over some of the other ones. While it exploited a hole in the format I really liked, and it was a style of play that in watching or reading the coverage, it was something that I thought I would enjoy playing. There was also the fact that it was a 4-color deck that was playing all basic lands. And as a high school student with no job, that was really appealing to me. I didn't have to try to trade for shock lands. My one regret in building this deck is I didn't build it sooner and do better for longer. But what it was that made this deck special is Early Harvest. You played all basic lands specifically because you were playing Early Harvest. Early Harvest is an instant for green, 1 that says untap all basic lands you control. With an enchantment that lets your lands tap for additional mana. Stop me if you've heard this before. Where, you're untapping and making a bunch of extra mana, and then you're firing a giant X spell at somebody's head. Anybody playing right now knows what that looks like. Anybody playing right now knows what that is. That's Wilderness Reclamation, except we're even more all in on the combo aspect. There were no fogs. There was very little in the way of interaction. We were playing some combination, we played Muddle the Mixture anyway because of because of the transmute on it. But then we also played Remand as, kind of a catch-all card that would allow us to combo off through a counterspell or two. That kind of thing. Get your opponent to tap low and then Remand their attempt to stop you. And in particular in this deck, it was just really, really good in the early game, digging us through our deck to find more stuff. So, how do we get all this mana on the board? Well, anybody who's familiar with the Ramp archetype knows. Because this was a standard format that featured Sakura Tribe Elder, Kodama's Reach, which is Cultivate before Cultivate existed. It's Cultivate with the Arcane subtype strapped onto it. And then some of the lists would also play Rampant Growth. Like as a 2 of sometimes. You didn't want to overload on ramp effects because you also needed to play all your combo pieces. And the name of the game with this deck, instead of being a lot of card selection, we were a lot of redundancy. We had a lot of different ways to get to the same cards. Because we had Drift of Phantasms and Muddle the Mixture that had Transmute in the main deck. Drift of Phantasms for blue 1 would transmute, and you discard it from your hand, go get any 3-drop from your deck, put it into your hand. Conveniently, Early Harvest costs 3. That's direct. Transmute, Drift of Phantasms, get Early Harvest, cast Early Harvest, respond by tapping mana, untap, do it again. Like that was the combo. But it gets better than that because we went even further down the redundancy rabbit hole and played Muddle the Mixture along with a 1 of Weird Harvest. Weird Harvest being green X. Each player searches their library for X creatures, reveals them to their opponent, and puts them into their hand. So if you didn't have Drift, but you had Muddle, you could transmute Muddle for Weird Harvest, cast Weird Harvest, get Drift, transmute Drift for Early Harvest, cast Early Harvest to untap, and now you would Weird Harvest for 2 to get double Drift, and then you would use the second Drift to go get your second Early Harvest and proceed to combo off. That was the nature of the beast. So what were we killing our opponent with? Well, we had 2 cards. 3 if you count my weird, crazy sideboard tech against Shining Shoal. 1 was Maga, Traitor to Mortals, and Maga was the only reason the stock list was playing black. Mana cost was black X for a 0/0, but Maga enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters. And when Maga enters the battlefield, target player loses X life. When X is 23, that's a lot. And it was on a creature, which, a lot of players weren't really, it was life loss and it was on a creature, so it was difficult to interact with without exactly counter spells. And the fact that it wasn't an instant or sorcery meant it won the mirror outside of a Remand because we didn't cast an instant or sorcery, so Muddle couldn't counter it. And then the other primary win condition was a 1 of Invoke the Firemind for blue X or blue red X. Either target player draws X cards or you draw X cards or deal X damage to any target. Which was something that you would use in conjunction with your Besiju who shelters all out of the sideboard, because if you happened upon an opponent that was playing a bunch of counterspells, Besiju could float mana that you would pay life for and then would make your instant or sorcery uncounterable. So that was, a power play. And there were, some corner case scenarios where you were like halfway through the combo, but you really needed to find another Early Harvest. So you would invoke for like 5 or 6, leaving enough mana open to either cast Early Harvest outright or transmute a Drift to find another Early Harvest, just to draw cards and then continue to combo off. It was a lot more difficult to play than it got credit for, being a deck that just wants to make a butt ton of mana early in the game and kill your opponent, like it was difficult to play. There were some lines that you had to take at times that just weren't particularly obvious if you wanted to get there. And then the thing that really, the glue that held the deck together more than anything else, is a card that needs no introduction because it's banned in every format it would otherwise be legal in, except for the one where it can't possibly be banned and it's restricted there. And obviously Commander, because Commander is, well, Commander. That card being Sensei's Divining Top. In a deck with as many shuffle effects as we had, Sensei's Divining Top was obscenely good. With, all the ramp spells, all the transmute. Sensei's Divining Top almost never saw the same 3 cards. Almost never saw the same 3 cards. So, what did we do when Plan A didn't work? Well, in Game 1, we lost a lot. And often in Game 2, if we were up against a more counterspell intensive control deck, or against a deck that was going to be, really aggressive and disrupting our hand with cards like Castigate and Persecute, we would sideboard into creatures because we had that option. We would just sideboard into stuff like Kodama the North Tree. Kodama the North Tree. Iwamori of the Open Fist was another one that saw a fair amount of play because it was a 4-drop 5/5. Gave you the ability to wall off an aggro deck, and it didn't matter that you let them put a legendary into play. Like, these are the things we used to do for, big dumb creatures. Similar to what the Zoo deck was doing at the time with Hunted Wumpus. In the matchups where you wanted Hunted Wumpus specifically, it was so big that it didn't matter what your opponent played off of it. So, Iwamori was kind of the same way. You would board it out, you board it in against the aggro decks because it would be so big that they couldn't, nothing they have is bigger than it anyway. It just blocks all day because it's a 5/5. Or your 4-drop trades with their 4-drop, and that's okay. You live another turn and you get to set up another combo turn. Now, as far as actual tournament results, I think I only got to play it once. But it was the first FNM I ever played where I cashed. I made 4th. And that was particularly stressful at the time because the FNM I played at, I was driving an hour one way to go. And the tournament format was single elimination because the owner didn't want to be there all night. So he didn't want to have to wait on a bunch of games to finish. If you lost, you were done. And I eked out a 4th place finish with a combo deck that, as a beginner, I should not have been able to play. Of course, it also warped my perception of my ability to play Magic for a while. Convinced me that because I was good at playing specifically that deck, I was good at playing combo decks in general, and I'm not good at combo decks at all. Not normally, anyway. Decks like that one, I'm pretty good at it. Math and, being able to find the right window to just kind of jam the combo down. But a deck like Storm, I'm horrible with Storm decks. If I've got a predetermined combo that I know what I got to do, I know what I got to get to in order to win the game, that's a whole different animal. I can do that all day. So Heartbeat Harvest was special to me because it was the first deck I ever built that was powerful enough to compete. It was the cheapest hyper-competitive deck I've ever built. The lone possible exception being Mono Blue Tempo. But in the case of the Heartbeat deck, I think I spent like $10 on it, and that was to get the last 3 copies of Early Harvest after I traded for 1. And that deck it served me so well because while I didn't play a lot of tournaments with it, because again my nearest LGS was an hour away from the house, and I was in high school and I didn't have time. There were a lot of excuses / reasons as to why I didn't get to play Magic the way I wanted to at the time. But suffice it to say, I didn't play like I should have been when I was younger. But I was in high school. I didn't play like I wanted to. I did play a ton at the lunch tables, and let me tell you, I racked up a horrific win streak at the lunch tables playing that deck. It was the deck that gave me confidence in my competitive ability. It was the deck that, made me see that Magic, it was something that I could have fun at and still be good at. And it was everything I wanted out of my first competitive deck. And, one of these days, that's going to be one of the decks I get back together just to sit on, reminisce, that kind of thing. I didn't even realize how powerful half the stuff was at the time. I knew that using Divining Top and shuffling was good because I did it, not because anybody told me it was good. I knew that, I recognized what I needed to play around to the point that I even played a sideboard card that was widely considered awful at the time. The sideboard card in question being Psychic Drain as a direct muddle target that I could go get. It was black, blue, X, and it was target player mills X cards and you gain X life. And it was in the board for decks that, one, I thought were going to bring in Shining Shoal, and two, didn't have a lot of win conditions. And it was one of those cards that would almost never come up, but when it did, it was backbreaking, and that's kind of how it worked out. That's the card that got me into 4th place at that F&M of like 28 players that night. So, say what you will. Heartbeat Harvest, it's got a history. It was more unfair when it translated over to Extended. Technically speaking, it's legal in Modern, it's just not good enough. Way too slow. And you have to play basic lands. Can't do it. But we're pulling in the driveway. So this has been Riding in Cars with Cards. Again, Heartbeat Harvest, one of my favorite decks of all time. Would it stand up against basically any of the other great ones I've ever built? Probably not. In a head-to-head fight. The 5-color Cascade deck was even more sacky than the Heartbeat deck was. The blue-white tokens deck had counter magic and a clock, and then 4-color Copycat was a turn faster. Blue-black Terramander is much better. Blue-black Terramander and Mono-blue Tempo both would disrupt it to pieces. And Temur Reclamation does what Heartbeat does without having to play so many redundant combo pieces. So it can also represent an actual proper control game plan along the way. So in the annals of history of Magic, it never will go down as one of the most powerful decks ever played. But it was one of the most powerful decks in that format. And as a high school kid who could not afford a great deck, that's the biggest takeaway I got out of Heartbeat. Sometimes it's possible to build a good deck for cheap. That was my first exposure to that. That was my first example of a competitive budget deck. So it's those kinds of decks that I definitely keep an eye on. And I think you should too. You got questions, comments, concerns, put them down there. You got suggestions for future episode topics, put them down there. Or send them to me at Homeward Path MTG on Twitter, in the Homeward Pathfinders Facebook group. Or if you're a patron of the show, you get priority access to getting your deck list done on this show. So thanks again for watching, everybody. I hope you have a good week, and we'll catch you Thursday while we're talking combo decks on the Homeward Path.